This is the story of Thelma Morgan Converse, a beautiful, haunting phantom on the periphery of the two greatest scandals of the 20th century. She was the identical twin sister of Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt. When Gloria was destroyed in the trial of the century, Thelma stood by her side, only to be tarnished by association and legally forbidden from ever seeing her own niece. She was also the mistress of the Prince of Wales. In a fateful moment of trust, she asked her friend Wallis Simpson to look after him, a mistake that cost her the prince and inadvertently set the stage for the abdication crisis. Thelma's life was a collision of unimaginable privilege and profound second-hand loss. She was the woman who had a front row seat to the collapse of the Vanderbilt dynasty and the Windsor dynasty. This is not the story of the mother who lost the child or the woman who took the king. This is the story of the aunt who saw it all and the mistress who lost it all. This is the story of the twin who witnessed the fall of two empires. To understand Thelma and her identical twin, Gloria, you must understand the world that built them, a transatlantic mirage of old-world aristocracy and pathological insecurity. Born in Switzerland in 1904, they were the daughters of an American diplomat, Harry Hayes Morgan. Their family had a name, they had connections, and they had European breeding. The only thing they didn't have was money. This was the single most important psychological fact of their childhood. They were the very definition of genteel poverty. They drifted through European capitals, staying in the grandest hotels, but always on the brink of financial ruin. This upbringing, orchestrated by their ambitious mother Laura, forged the twins with a singular purpose. They were not raised to be educated, they were raised to be marketed. This was the age of the dollar princess, but the Morgans were a more desperate variation. They were beauty princesses. They had no dollars. Their beauty was their dowry. And as identical twins, the delectable Delmar twins ran, they were a unique commodity. Their entire youth was geared toward one goal, to marry and to marry for security. The effect was immediate. Thelma and Gloria were the it girls of the age. They were the original celebutantes, young, beautiful, impossibly chic, with their distinct European accents and devastatingly charming. But even then, their deep ingrained insecurity haunted them. They were famous, they were in all the society columns, but they were still poor. In a brief, desperate teenage rebellion and an equally desperate need for cash, the 16-year-old twins, along with their sister Consuelo, auditioned for and appeared as uncredited extras in the 1922 Marion Davies film, The Young Diana, produced by Cosmopolitan and released by Paramount. Their mother, Laura, was horrified. This was not the plan. In her world, actresses were little better than courtesans. They were looked at, but they were not married, not by the right people. She quickly and forcefully ended their burgeoning film careers. The real prize, she knew, was close. Thelma, always the more impulsive, the more restless of the two, was the first to jump. She married James Vale Converse on February 16, 1922, at 17. He was about 29 and they were divorced by 1925. Converse was the grandson of Theodore N. Vale, the former president of AT&T. But in the complex coded world of the Gilded Age, he was the wrong kind of wealthy. Jimmy Converse was not New York society. He was not a Vanderbilt or an Astor or even a Morgan, as in J.P. Morgan. Above all, he was a professional horseman. He was a Grand Circuit racer, a man who traveled the country, worked with his hands, and lived in the dusty world of tracks and stables. To Laura Morgan, this was a disaster. It betrayed her entire training. In her eyes, he was little more than a stable hand. But Thelma, desperate for freedom, desperate for her own life, and perhaps genuinely infatuated, eloped. The marriage was an immediate, predictable, and total disaster. The 16-year-old European-bred sophisticate had nothing in common with the rugged, 33-year-old all-American horseman. The life he offered was not Paris salons or London balls. It was a life of work. The marriage lasted just 3 years, producing no children. By 1925, Thelma was back with her mother. She was 19 years old. She was divorced. And in the brutal, unforgiving marriage market of the 1920s, she was damaged goods. She now had a new, slightly less glamorous name, Thelma Morgan Converse. She was right back where she started, only now she was a failure. The pressure on her identical twin, Gloria, was now immense. Thelma had failed. Gloria had to succeed. She was the family's last best hope. And in 1923, 18-year-old Gloria Morgan was introduced to Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt. This was the moment. This was the collision. This is where the desperate, glittering, insecure world of the Morgans slammed into its first dying empire. Reginald Reggie Vanderbilt wasn't just a rich man. He wasn't just a society figure. He was a Vanderbilt. By 1923, he was the last surviving son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the man who built the family's grandest, most opulent palace, the Breakers, in Newport. He was the brother of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the most powerful and serious woman in American society. He was American royalty. He was also, to put it plainly, a catastrophic human failure. When he met 18-year-old Gloria Morgan, Reggie was 43. He was a notorious gambler, an addict, and by his own estimation, he had already burned through the modern equivalent of $100 million. He was a chronic, debilitating alcoholic, his body ravaged by cirrhosis of the liver. He was already divorced from his first wife, with whom he had a daughter, Kathleen. Reggie Vanderbilt was pale, chronically ill, shaky, and haunted by the knowledge that he was at the end of his line. His entire life had been lived in the shadow of his brilliant but disinherited older brother, Cornelius III, and his powerful, artistic, and formidable sister, Gertrude. Reggie was the weak link. He was the failure. He was the one who, as his father had accurately and cruelly predicted, would never be good for anything but spending money. And now, he was 43, sick, and desperate for a new young life and a new young male heir. He saw Gloria Morgan. He was captivated. She was 18, breathtakingly beautiful, impeccably mannered, and most importantly, she was available. The Morgan family, led by Mother Laura, saw none of his flaws, or rather they saw them, and they didn't care. What mattered was the name, Vanderbilt. It was the Holy Grail. It was the security, the power, and the prestige they had craved all their lives. When Reggie proposed, the Vanderbilt family was horrified, utterly appalled. They saw the Morgan twins for exactly what they were, penniless, glamorous, and lethally dangerous social climbers. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney in particular was furious. She saw Gloria as a child, a literal gold digger, taking advantage of her weak, dying brother. The family begged Reggie not to do it. They pleaded with him. But Reggie, weak, infatuated, and stubborn, was determined. On March 6, 1923, in a quiet ceremony at a friend's house, a ceremony boycotted by almost the entire Vanderbilt family, including Gertrude, 18-year-old Gloria Morgan married 43-year-old Reginald Vanderbilt. And who was by her side, as matron of honor? Her identical twin, her other half, Thelma Morgan Converse. Imagine that scene, the psychological weight of it. Thelma, the 19-year-old divorcee, the failed twin, watching her sister, her mirror image, win the ultimate prize. The deal was done. One of the twins had made it. The family, at last, was secure. But what did that mean for Thelma? She was, once again, the spare twin. Her sister was now Mrs. Reginald Vanderbilt, living in a palace on Fifth Avenue, with access to the greatest and most stable fortune in the country. Thelma was just Thelma, the divorcee, the failure? Here, however, the story takes its first crucial psychological turn. Reggie Vanderbilt wasn't just in love with his new wife, Gloria. He was enchanted by the set. He loved having these two beautiful, identical young women at his side. It was a spectacle. It was perhaps the last great, beautiful thing he could acquire. He doted on his wife, and he doted on his sister-in-law. For the first time, Thelma and Gloria were living the life they were raised for. They had unlimited money. They were the center of New York society. They were inseparable. And Thelma's status as the identical twin of the new Mrs. Vanderbilt once again made her one of the most desirable women in the world. She was not on the market for long. Just 6 months after her sister's wedding, Thelma, now traveling in the most elite circles, was in Paris. There, she met Marmaduke Furness, 1st Viscount Furness. He soon proposed, and they married in 1926. Duke, as he was known, was 40, another man, like Reggie, more than 20 years her senior. But Duke Furness was no Reggie Vanderbilt. He was not a dying heir bleeding out an old fortune. He was a self-made man, a British shipping magnate who had built an immense modern fortune. He had been made a viscount for his contributions to the government during the war. He was, simply put, one of the richest men in the world. Like Reggie, he was a notorious womanizer. Also, like Reggie, he was looking for a young, beautiful, aristocratic adjacent wife to be the ornament for his wealth. He was mesmerized by Thelma and proposed almost immediately. On June 27, 1926, Thelma Morgan Converse married Lord Furness. She was now Thelma, Lady Furness. In the space of 3 years, the Morgan twins had done the impossible. The two penniless girls from a nomadic, precarious family had conquered the two most powerful empires in the world. Gloria was a Vanderbilt, the pinnacle of American royalty. Thelma was now British nobility Lady Furness, in possession of a title and a massive fortune. They were 22 years old. They had won. The game was over. Their mother's long, desperate campaign had succeeded spectacularly. But of course, the game hadn't even begun. This was, in truth, merely the prelude, because the foundations of their success were built on sand. They had married into two great dynasties, but they had, in their own ways, married hollow men, and the first hollow foundation was about to collapse. In 1924, a year after her marriage, Gloria Vanderbilt gave birth to a daughter. They named her Gloria, Little Gloria. She was the new Vanderbilt heir. Just 19 months later, on September 4th, 1925, Reginald Vanderbilt, his body in total collapse from a lifetime of alcoholism, died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was 45 years old. His wife, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, was just 21 years old. She was a widow. And his tiny 1.5-year-old daughter, little Gloria, was the heir to a $5 million trust fund. Reggie's death was an immediate catastrophe for Gloria, plunging her into the precarious existence of a 21-year-old widow, hated by her in-laws. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, her twin's path was taking the exact opposite trajectory. Thelma, Lady Furness's star, was only just beginning to rise. The Vanderbilt family, led by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, had never trusted her. They had never liked her. And now they were watching her. They watched her every move, her every expenditure, her every trip. And they were waiting for her to make the one fatal mistake that would allow them to take back what they believed was theirs: the child, the money, and the name. But while that particular storm cloud was gathering over New York, Thelma was living in her own brilliant sunshine. It was a glittering royal prelude that would, ironically, help seal her sister's fate and ultimately her own. Thelma's marriage to Lord Furness was predictably a sham. He was a serial philanderer, busy and often absent. She was young, beautiful, and now incredibly wealthy. They had one son, William Anthony Tony Furness, born in 1929, but for the most part, they lived entirely separate lives. Duke had his shipping business and his other women. Thelma had her son, her title, and all of London society at her feet. She was one of the great hostesses of her day. And in 1929, at a party at her own home, Borough Court, she was introduced to the man every woman in the world desired, David, Prince of Wales, the heir to the British throne. At the time, the prince was the most famous and adored man on the planet. He was a global celebrity, handsome, charming, with a tragic, boyish vulnerability. He was the people's prince. He was also privately a deeply lonely, emotionally stunted, and profoundly restless man. As history has proven, he was pathologically drawn to powerful, nurturing, and, most importantly, married women. A married woman was safe. She was a companion, a mother figure, but she could not by definition be a queen. He was bored with his current mistress. And he saw Thelma, Lady Furness. She was American, which he loved. She was beautiful. She was married to a rich, distant, and complacent husband. She was, in every way, perfect. He fell for her, hard. And for the next 5 years, from 1929 to 1934, Thelma Lady Furness, our Thelma Morgan Converse, was the official, albeit discreet, mistress of the future King of England. She was the woman he brought to his private sanctuary, Fort Belvedere. She was the one who hosted his intimate dinners. She was the one who listened to his endless bitter complaints about his father, King George V, and the suffocating, soul-crushing boredom of his royal duties. She was, for all intents and purposes, the unofficial queen-in-waiting. And who was at her side nearly every step of the way? Her identical twin, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt. This is the phantom. This is the other half of our witness. Gloria by now was living the life of a young, wealthy, transatlantic widow. She had fled the oppressive scrutiny of the Vanderbilts in New York and was now living in Paris and London, often with Thelma. She left her daughter, little Gloria, in America in the care of her beloved nanny, Emma Sullivan Kieslich, and her own mother, Laura Morgan. This was a fatal, tragic mistake, but at the time, it seemed logical. She and Thelma were the delectable Delmar twins all over again, only now they were the most glamorous widow and the most glamorous royal mistress in the world. And Gloria was her sister's shadow, her confidant, her alibi. When Thelma was with the prince, Gloria was often present. She became a trusted and liked member of the prince's inner circle. The prince adored them both. He loved the spectacle of the two beautiful, identical sisters. It was exotic, American, and thrilling. The three of them, along with a few others, formed a tight, exclusive, and glittering little club. Thelma, Lady Furness, was at the absolute apex of her life. She had achieved what her mother had only dreamed of. She had the title, she had the wealth, and she had the heart of the king. She was powerful, she was secure, she believed she was invulnerable. It was from this dizzying, unassailable height that she first met a quiet, plain, and socially ambitious American couple who were desperately and awkwardly trying to break into the prince's set. Mr. and Mrs. Ernest Simpson. Wallis Simpson at this point was a nobody. She was a divorced American woman on her second marriage to a quiet, unassuming shipping executive. She was not beautiful by any conventional standard. She was not wealthy. She had no title. As Thelma herself later wrote, she was not particularly attractive. Her voice was high and her laugh was harsh. She looked flat, almost angular, but she was sharp. She was witty. And she was intensely, ruthlessly ambitious. Thelma, the reigning queen, secure in her power, found Wallis amusing. She was a fellow American. She was a good fourth for a game of bridge. She was harmless. Thelma, in a grand casual gesture of aristocratic largesse, took Wallis under her wing. She invited her to parties and included her in the intimate weekends at Fort Belvedere with the prince. Witness Thelma Converse saw the whole thing, but Gloria, her twin, reportedly felt the chill first. Gloria, who had spent a decade navigating the shark-infested waters of the Vanderbilt family, knew a predator when she saw one. She didn't trust Wallis. She warned Thelma. But Thelma, Lady Furness, was in love. She was adored. She was the queen of this perfect, small world. She brushed it off. What threat could such a plain, middle-aged American woman possibly be? Thelma had it all. Her sister Gloria, her lover the prince, her son, and her wealth. And then in January 1934, she received a frantic message from America. Her sister Gloria was in trouble, serious trouble. The nanny Emma Kieslich had secretly gone to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. She had told her stories. The mother, Laura Morgan, in a panic over money, had also turned on her own daughter. Gertrude Whitney, the woman who had waited patiently for 10 years, had finally made her move. She had filed a lawsuit for custody of little Gloria, accusing Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt of being an unfit and improper mother. Thelma's twin, her other half, was about to be destroyed. Thelma had to go. She had to go to New York to stand by her sister. Before leaving London, she had a farewell dinner with the prince. Wallis Simpson and her husband, Ernest, were there. In her memoirs, Thelma recalled the fateful, laughably casual words she spoke to Wallis that night, a sentence that quite literally changed the world. "Oh, Wallis," Thelma said, "the little man is going to be so lonely. Do look after him for me. See that he doesn't get into any mischief." Wallis, she remembered, smiled, her thin, sharp smile, and replied, "Of course, Thelma. You know I will." Thelma, Lady Furness, set sail for New York. She was sailing toward one war, with no idea that her own words had just surrendered another. She was arriving to support her twin, Gloria, in the Vanderbilt trial. And she would never, ever see the Prince of Wales as his mistress again. When Thelma, Lady Furness, stepped off the ocean liner in New York in the winter of 1934, she was walking from one world into another. She had left the privileged, discreet, adoring bubble of the British royal set. She had left her son, Tony. She had left her lover, the future King of England. She arrived as a warrior, an aristocrat, a woman of power, come to rescue her twin in distress. She was Thelma, Lady Furness, mistress to a prince. She was here to lend her social weight, her prestige, and her quiet, unshakable support to her sister Gloria. She was walking straight into an abattoir. The Gloria Vanderbilt custody trial was not a polite, private family dispute. From the first moment, it was an all-out declaration of war. And it would become the most sensational, lurid, and bizarre public spectacle of the 1930s. This was the trial of the century, and Thelma had just arrived, perfectly dressed, to step into the center of the arena. The battlefield was the New York State Supreme Court. The year was 1934. The Great Depression was at its peak. Millions were unemployed. Families were in breadlines, and the public was simmering with a deep populist rage against the ultra-wealthy. And into this grim, desperate world, the press delivered a gift, a Roman circus. The richest, most fabled family in America, the Vanderbilts, were tearing themselves apart in public. The public wasn't just fascinated, they were rabid. They craved the sight of their gods bleeding. The combatants were perfectly cast. On one side, the plaintiff, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. She was 59, the daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the sister of the late Reggie. She was everything the Morgan twins were not. She was immensely, powerfully, seriously wealthy, having married into the Whitney family fortune. She was a respected and practicing sculptor, a serious patron of the arts, who had founded the Whitney Museum of American Art. She was old New York. She was stern, formidable, morally rigid, and saw herself as the righteous protector of the Vanderbilt legacy. In her eyes, her brother Reggie had made a disastrous, fatal mistake in marrying a penniless 18-year-old social climber. She had watched Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt for 10 years, and her quiet, aristocratic contempt had hardened into a cold, righteous, and unbending rage. She wasn't just fighting for her niece. She was fighting to cleanse the Morgan stain from the Vanderbilt line. On the other side, the defense, the Morgan women, a triumvirate. There was Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, the mother, now 30, a widow for a decade, still breathtakingly beautiful and utterly terrified. She was a woman raised to party, not to fight. She had no money of her own, as the Vanderbilt lawyers had frozen her access to her daughter's trust. Then there was Laura Delphine Morgan, the matriarch, the general's daughter. She was the one who had engineered this great marriage, and she was now fighting to protect the family's only real asset, her granddaughter's trust fund. But Laura, in a fatal panic over money, had also been secretly writing letters of complaint to the Vanderbilts, letters that would be used as evidence against her own daughter. She was a compromised, frightened, and unreliable general. And then there was our Thelma Lady Furness. She was not a legal party to the case. She was not the mother. She was not the grandmother. But she would become the trial's crucial secondary target. Why? Because she and Gloria were identical. They were inseparable. They lived together in Paris. They traveled together. They partied together. In the eyes of the law and the public, they were a single, indivisible entity. To prove Gloria was an unfit mother, Gertrude's lawyers, led by a brilliant, ruthless, and theatrical man named Nathan Birkin, had to prove that the environment she lived in was unfit. Thelma was the environment. The prize, of course, was 10-year-old Gloria Vanderbilt, little Gloria. She was a quiet, lonely, confused child who had lived her life shuttled between nannies and relatives. She was also the beneficiary of a $4 million trust fund, the equivalent of nearly $100 million today. Whoever controlled the child controlled the money. Gertrude Whitney's petition was a cannonball. It accused Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt of being an unfit and improper mother. It claimed she abandoned her daughter to nannies for months, sometimes years at a time, while she gallivanted around Europe. It claimed she squandered the trust fund not on the child's upbringing, but on her own wasteful and scandalous lifestyle. This was bad enough, but it was the conventional, predictable charge. Gloria's lawyers were prepared for that. They would argue that this was how all people of their class raised children. Nannies were the norm. Gertrude Whitney herself, they'd say, had raised her own children with nannies. But Gertrude's lawyers had a secret weapon. They hadn't just observed Gloria's lifestyle. They had infiltrated it. For years, the Vanderbilts had been paying detectives. They had interviewed and, crucially, paid Gloria's disgruntled, dismissed, or current servants. This was the capote element, the moment the downstairs world turns on the upstairs with vengeful precision. The servants, the maids, the butlers, the nannies had seen everything. They had listened at keyholes. They had read discarded letters. And now, on the Vanderbilt payroll, they were about to tell. The trial began. The press packed the courtroom. Flashbulbs popped as the Morgan twins entered. Two identical, defiant, impossibly chic figures, dressed in identical, elegant black. And Thelma sat down, not in the gallery, but at the defense table next to her twin, a living, breathing, identical statement of support. "You are not just accusing her," her presence said, "you are accusing us." It was the most loyal and the most catastrophic mistake she could have made. At first, the testimony was what she expected. Servants testified that Mrs. Vanderbilt rarely saw her daughter, that she was out all night, every night, that there were constant loud parties, a parade of men, endless cocktails. The Morgan lawyers fired back. This was slander. This was the gossip of paid-off, disgruntled employees. But Nathan Birkin, the Vanderbilt lawyer, was just getting started. He wasn't just painting a picture of a party girl. He was painting a picture of a degenerate, and he used Thelma to do it. He called Thelma Lady Furness to the stand. Imagine the scene. Thelma, the reigning queen, the Viscountess, gliding to the witness box. She is there as a character witness for her sister. She is confident. She is, after all, Lady Furness. Nathan Birkin began his questioning. He didn't care what she had to say about Gloria's mothering. He cared about her. "You are you not?" he purred. "Thelma, Lady Furness?" "I am." "And you are the wife of Lord Furness?" "I am." "And you are you not?" he pressed on, his voice dropping, "an intimate friend of the Prince of Wales?" The courtroom went silent. This was no secret in London society, but it was a bombshell in a public New York courtroom. Thelma froze. She was trapped. She could not lie under oath. "I'm a friend, yes," she stammered. "An intimate friend, Lady Furness?" Birkin urged. "Have you not visited him at his private residence, Fort Belvedere?" "Yes." "Without your husband, Lord Furness?" "Yes." And just like that, it was done. In a few deft, brutal questions, Birkin had proven, in open court, that Thelma Furness was an adulteress. And not just any adulteress, but the mistress of a future king. The trap was sprung. Thelma's testimony was now worthless. How could this woman, this adulteress, speak to her sister's moral character? Birkin wasn't finished. He had just proven Thelma's degeneracy. Now, he would use Thelma to prove Gloria's. He asked about their life in Paris. He asked about their parties. He asked about their friends. He asked about the fast set they ran with. He was piece by piece painting a single damning portrait of the Morgan sisters. They were not two people. They were one entity, a fast, un-American, title-chasing, throne-sleeping, child-neglecting block of moral corruption. Thelma, by trying to help, had only reinforced his narrative. She stepped down from the stand, shaking, humiliated. She had entered as a shield, and she had been turned into a weapon. But the killing blow was yet to come. Birkin called his star witness, the witness who would end the trial and destroy the Morgan reputation forever. Her name was Mademoiselle Marie-Louise Caillot. She was Gloria's former lady's maid, a French woman who had been with Gloria and Thelma in their Paris apartment. She was quiet, precise, and about to drop an atomic bomb. Birkin walked her through her testimony. He asked about the parties. He asked about the visitors. And then he asked about Gloria's special friends. He asked specifically about a woman named Nada Mountbatten, the Marchioness of Milford Haven. Thelma watched, her blood running cold. She knew Nada. Nada was part of her set. She was a Russian royal married into the British aristocracy. She was a cousin of the Prince of Wales. She was a friend. Birkin asked Mademoiselle Caillot what she had observed between her employer, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, and the Marchioness of Milford Haven. The maid's testimony was quiet, devastating, and pornographic in its 1934 detail. She testified that she had, on multiple occasions, walked into Gloria's bedroom and found her on the bed with Nada Mountbatten. She testified to seeing them kissing like lovers. She described in graphic detail indecent and lewd books and magazines left open in the room. She spoke of depraved and degenerate behavior. This was the moment the trial was won and lost. In 1934, this accusation wasn't just scandalous. It wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a moral crime. In the eyes of the law and the public, it was proof of a profound psychological corruption, and it was aimed like a poisoned arrow directly at Gloria. Thelma had to sit there, silent, in the packed courtroom, and watch her identical twin, her other half, be publicly, graphically, and ruthlessly accused of being a lesbian. She watched Gloria's face crumble. She watched her sister, a woman who had never had to fight for anything, completely and totally disintegrate. Gloria and her lawyers denied it vehemently. The scandal exploded across the Atlantic. In London, Nada Mountbatten was horrified. Her name was now on the front page of every tabloid. She immediately got on a ship to New York to defend her honor and her friends. She swept into the courtroom, a vision of European aristocracy, dripping in furs. She took the stand. She was a formidable, angry witness. She declared in her thick Russo-British accent that the maid's entire story was a tissue of lies. She was, she said, a dismissed and disgruntled servant, obviously paid by the Vanderbilts. But it didn't matter. The mud had been thrown, and it stuck. The public didn't care about the denial. They only cared about the accusation. From this moment, the trial descended into pure madness. The press went into a feeding frenzy. The headline screamed, "Vice, Scandal, Lesbian Rights at Vandy Home." And Thelma Converse, the identical twin, was now, by association, guilty of the same. She was no longer Thelma, Lady Furness, the royal mistress. She was the other one, the scandalous Morgan twins. The judge, John F. Carew, was a conservative, old-school Irish Catholic. He was visibly, profoundly shocked by this testimony. This is where the trial took its strangest, most theatrical turn. Judge Carew, appalled by the indecent and shocking nature of what was being discussed, suddenly slammed his gavel. He announced he was clearing the courtroom. He kicked out the press and the public. This disgusting testimony, he declared, would be heard in camera, in private, to protect public morality. This was, of course, the worst possible thing he could have done. By banning the press, he signaled to the world that the testimony was so shocking, so depraved, it could not even be printed. The public's imagination, already feverish, went into overdrive. What was happening in that locked room? The rumors became infinitely worse than the reality. And Thelma was inside that locked room, silently watching her sister's life be systematically destroyed. The trial dragged on for weeks. It became a national obsession. Judge Carew heard the testimony from the maids, the sisters, the aristocrats. He heard all the disgusting testimony. Now, he announced, he would hear from the only witness who truly mattered. He cleared the chambers. He would personally interview the 10-year-old poor little rich girl, Gloria Vanderbilt. What happened in that room was the heartbreaking psychological climax of the entire affair. Little Gloria was not an adult. She was a 10-year-old child who had now been living with her beloved nanny, Emma Kieslich, who hated the Morgans, and her Aunt Gertrude for months. She had been systematically, carefully, and successfully indoctrinated. Little Gloria, frightened, confused, and desperate to please the adults in the room, told the judge what she had been taught to say. She said she loved her nanny, she loved her Aunt Gertrude, she loved her aunt's house at the Whitney estate. And her mother? She said, in a small, trembling voice, that she was afraid of her mother. She said her mother, Gloria, was a stranger, a beautiful scented phantom who would rush in, smelling of perfume, kiss her, and leave. The child's testimony was the final nail in the coffin. It was no longer about alleged lesbianism or parties or money. It was about a little girl who, in her own words, had chosen. She had chosen the Vanderbilts. Judge Carew had everything he needed. He returned to the open courtroom. The press was allowed back in. The room was silent. Thelma sat next to her twin, Gloria, their identical faces pale, braced for the impact. Judge Carew delivered his ruling. It was not just a legal ruling. It was a moral execution. He blasted Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, the mother, from the bench. He called her lifestyle un-American. He called her wasteful, indifferent, and morally unfit. He spoke of the corrupt and dangerous environment she had created. He stripped Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt of custody. Little Gloria was to be given permanently to her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Gloria, the mother, would be allowed to see her daughter, but only on weekends. And, in a final humiliating blow, those visits had to be supervised. She was never to be alone with her own child. And then the judge turned his attention to the environment, to the sister. It was done. Thelma, who had crossed an ocean to help, had been legally, officially, and publicly branded a monster, a danger to children. The gavel fell. The flashbulbs exploded. Thelma and Gloria sat stunned as their world dissolved. They had lost. Gloria had lost her child. She had lost her money. They had both lost their names. And Thelma had lost everything. She had sat there, loyal to her twin, and for it, had been publicly crucified. Her reputation was in ruins. She was 30 years old. She was one of the scandalous Morgan twins. And all she could think in that moment of total catastrophic failure was that she needed to go home. She needed to get back to London, back to her son, back to Fort Belvedere, back to the one place on earth she was still safe, back to the little man who adored her. She had no idea that while she was being publicly executed in a New York courtroom, back in London, her friend Wallis Simpson had been looking after the prince very well indeed. She was running from one disaster straight into the arms of another. Thelma, Lady Furness, sat in her cabin on the RMS Majestic, heading east, back to England, her entire world echoing with the sound of her sister's failure and her own humiliation. She had failed. She, the powerful aristocrat, the royal mistress, had come to New York to be her twin's shield. Instead, she had been turned into a weapon. She had been forced under oath to admit her adultery with the Prince of Wales. She had been branded by a judge and the global press as one of the scandalous Morgan twins, a part of a degenerate environment. And finally, in the cruelest cut, she, Thelma, the aunt, had been legally, officially forbidden from ever seeing her niece, little Gloria, again. Imagine the psychological state of that voyage, a 6-day crossing, trapped in a steel box with nowhere to run. The ship's radio would have been crackling with the news. The other first-class passengers would have been whispering behind their hands as she walked, pale and defiant, into the dining room. She was Thelma, Lady Furness, and she had just been publicly, globally, and vulgarly shamed. But through the fog of humiliation, the loss of her sister, the cold, hard knot of personal disgrace, there was a single burning light. The little man. The Prince of Wales, her lover, her friend, her refuge. She had left him in the care of her harmless friend, Wallis. Now she was rushing back to him, not as a glamorous, powerful mistress, but as a refugee. She was damaged. She needed him. He would comfort her. He would protect her. He would listen to her story, his famous boyish blue eyes filling with sympathy. He would be horrified at how the American press, how the Vanderbilts had treated her. He would hold her at Fort Belvedere, and the cold, gray, grim horror of the New York courtroom would finally melt away. He was her safe harbor. He was her future. The ship docked at Southampton. She took the boat train to Victoria Station. The London air was damp and cold. As she stepped onto the platform, she scanned the crowd. Sometimes, on a romantic whim, he would send his car, or even be there himself, his collar turned up, a thrilling, boyish secret. There was no one, just her driver, his face impassive, a small cold flicker of disappointment, but she brushed it aside. Of course, he was the prince. He couldn't just meet a ship, he was busy. She arrived at her London home. It was cold, quiet. The mail was in a neat pile. She sifted through it. Bills, invitations from weeks ago, and a crisp, stiff envelope from her husband's law office. She opened it. It was not a letter. It was a legal notice. Lord Furness, the Duke, her absent and philandering husband, had followed the trial in New York with rage. He hadn't cared about her affair with the prince. That was an arrangement. But he cared very, very much about the name. The Furness name had been dragged through the American gutter. His wife, his Viscountess, had been publicly branded part of a degenerate circus, an adulteress, and a corrupting influence on a child. It was an intolerable, disgusting public humiliation. Thelma sat down, the paper in her hand. The last tiny piece of security she had left, her title, her name, her financial protection as Lady Furness, was gone. The New York trial hadn't just cost her her niece and her reputation. It had just cost her her marriage. Suddenly, terrifyingly, she was in freefall. She reached for the phone. She needed to talk to David. She called the prince's private number at Fort Belvedere. An equerry answered. Lady Furness, welcome back. His voice was polite and cold, terribly cold. I need to speak to His Royal Highness, Thelma said, her voice tighter than she wanted. I'm afraid His Royal Highness is unwell, my lady. He is away for the weekend. Away? But he knew I was arriving. Where is he? I am not at liberty to say, my lady. Then leave him a message, a desperate one. I must see him the moment he returns. Of course, my lady. The click of the receiver was the loudest sound in the world. She waited. An hour, 2. The London house grew dark. She didn't turn on the lights. She waited all night. The phone did not ring. She waited all the next day. The silence from the prince was a physical, suffocating thing. It was a silence she had never, ever known from him. For 5 years, he had been the man who called her, sometimes 5, 6 times a day. He was a man who craved constant reassurance. His silence was not an accident. It was a statement. Panic, cold and sharp, was now rising in her throat. The New York humiliation had been a loud, vulgar, public assault. This was a quiet, suffocating, private horror. What had happened? She called again. This time the equerry was even colder. His Royal Highness is in conference, my lady. She called her friends. Had they seen him? Oh, Thelma, darling, you're back. How dreadful for you, that whole trial. We read all about it. David? Oh, he's just, well, busy. No one would meet her eye. No one would tell her the truth. And then finally, the phone rang. She grabbed it. David? No, Thelma, darling. It's Wallis. The voice, sharp, American, and filled with a new, strange, terrifying confidence. Wallis. Thank God. Where is he? Is he all right? I can't reach him. Oh, the little man is just fine, Thelma. He's been frantic with work, He's just exhausted. I need to see him, Wallis. You don't understand what I've just been through." There was a pause, a tiny, perfect, calculated pause. "Yes, darling," we heard. "It sounds just ghastly. Thelma, why don't you come to the fort for dinner? Friday, just a few of us. A quiet little welcome home party." A wave of relief so powerful it made Thelma weak washed over her. It was a mistake. She had been panicking. It was fine. Wallis was her friend. David was busy. She was going home. "Oh, Wallis, thank you, thank you. I'll be there." "Wonderful, darling. See you then." The week until Friday was the longest of her life. She was a ghost in her own house. Her marriage was over. Her reputation was ruined. Her sister Gloria was calling from Paris, weeping, hysterical, and destitute, and Thelma had to listen, her own panic rising, and say, "It's all right, Gloria. It will be all right. I'm seeing David on Friday. He'll help us. He'll know what to do." He was her last hope, the last pillar of her entire life. Friday night arrived. She dressed more carefully than she ever had in her life. She was not just Thelma. She was Thelma, Lady Furness, the woman who had held the king's heart. She put on her best jewels, her most perfect dress. She had to remind him who she was. The car crunched on the gravel path to Fort Belvedere, the house she knew as well as her own, her house, her sanctuary. She walked in and stopped. It was wrong. The flowers were different. The furniture had shifted. The ugly little needlepoint pillow she had always hated was gone. In its place on the prince's favorite sofa was a small yapping pug she had never seen before. Wallis Simpson emerged from the drawing room to greet her. She was no longer the fawning, amusing friend Thelma had left behind. She was wearing a simple, severe, but astoundingly expensive dress. She was not smiling. She was assessing. "Thelma, darling," she said, her voice a razor blade wrapped in silk. "You made it." She did not move to kiss Thelma. She held out her hand like a hostess, like a queen. And then the prince emerged. He saw her and smiled, but it was not his smile. It was a stranger's smile, a polite, strained public relations smile. "Thelma," he said, his voice high and thin. He walked over and kissed her, not on the lips, but on the cheek. A clean, friendly, despicable peck. "Dreadful business," he said, backing away, not meeting her eye. "Dreadful. We were all horrified for you." He was reciting lines. He was speaking to her as if she were a distant cousin. Thelma's blood ran cold. She looked from his empty, smiling face to Wallis's sharp, triumphant one. And in that single, slow, horrifying moment, she knew. It wasn't just that he was with Wallis. It was that he was gone. She had been replaced. The rest of the dinner was a nightmare, a surreal, underwater horror show. It was a small group, just a few of us, as Wallis had said. But it was Wallis's group. The old familiar faces were gone. These were new people, friends of Wallis. And Wallis was sitting in Thelma's chair. She was the one leading the conversation. She was the one who knew the prince's private jokes. She was the one who, in a moment Thelma would never forget, snapped at the prince, "David, your drink is getting warm. You know you hate that." And the Prince of Wales, the future King of England, looked at her, not with anger, but with total, fearful, canine devotion, and said, "Yes, my dear. Of course, my dear." And he drank it. Thelma watched. She was invisible. She was a ghost at her own party. She realized this humiliation was far worse than the New York trial. The trial had been a loud, vulgar, public assault. This was a profound, private, and deeply feminine betrayal. Her friend had, with the cold precision of a surgeon, excised her. She had taken her home, her friends, her life, and her king, and now she was wearing them, as if they were her own. Thelma left the party. She barely said goodbye. No one tried to stop her. She sat in the back of the car, driving away from Fort Belvedere for the last time, in total annihilating silence. Divorced by her husband and replaced by the prince, Thelma lost both her title and her post. She was no longer a titled wife or a royal mistress. She was simply Thelma. She returned to her cold, empty London house. The phone was ringing. She picked it up. It was her sister Gloria calling from Paris, her voice frantic. "Thelma, Thelma, are you there? I've heard from the lawyers. They're cutting off all the money, all of it. Thelma, what are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And Thelma, the witness to the fall of the Vanderbilts, and now the first victim of the fall of the Windsors, sank to the floor. For the first time in her entire glittering, disastrous life, she had no answer. To be 30 years old, to be Thelma Morgan, she did not break. Not quite. It was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was, above all, Laura Morgan's daughter. She was a survivor. She took a breath. She looked at the telephone, the instrument of her sister's panic. "Gloria," she said, her voice small, cold, and suddenly terrifyingly clear. "Stop crying. Crying doesn't do any good." This was the afterlife. This was Act 3. The glittering high-stakes game was over. The stage had been struck. The audience had gone home, sated and bored. Now there was only the long, cold, and crushingly dull business of survival. Once again, Thelma and Gloria were exactly what they had been as children, penniless, nomadic, and insecure. Only now they were not the 19-year-old delectable Delmar twins, bright, hopeful conquerors of the world. They were 30, a lifetime in their brutal world. They weren't just poor, they were infamous. They were the scandalous Morgan twins. Gloria was the unfit mother, the alleged lesbian. Thelma was the royal adulteress, the perverse aunt. The name, the face, the only currency they had ever possessed was now a liability. They did what they had always done. They pooled their resources, they fled, they retreated to Paris, the one city that has always been a refuge for glamorous, slightly scandalous Americans. They took an apartment they could barely afford. They sold off the last of their jewelry, the pieces that didn't belong to the Furness or Vanderbilt estates, and they entered the most humiliating phase of their lives. They became once again professional guests. They lived on credit. They lived on the diminishing kindness of old friends who weren't powerful enough to be embarrassed by them. They were the extra women at dinner parties, the beautiful, tragic, identical ornaments who would charm a table for an evening in exchange for a meal and a glass of champagne. In every sense, they were ghosts of their former selves, haunting the fringes of the world that had once been their playground. And it was from this vantage point, from this cold, humiliating social purgatory, that Thelma Converse was forced to watch the final spectacular and utterly insane conclusion of the drama she had started. She was forced to watch the fall of the House of Windsor. The timeline is chilling in its proximity. The trial that ruined her was in late 1934. Throughout 1935, as Thelma and Gloria were hawking dresses, dodging creditors, and living in fear, the whispers from London grew. The Prince of Wales wasn't just seeing Wallis Simpson. He was obsessed. He was giving her jewels. He was taking her on royal tours. He was defying his father, the king. And Thelma had to read about it. In Vogue, in Tatler, in the very society pages that 1 year before had been filled with her face, her parties, her name. She had to watch from a cold apartment in Paris as the woman she had introduced to him, the woman she had trusted, systematically dismantled the British monarchy. Perhaps she and Gloria were the only two people on earth who understood the terrible, cosmic, and profoundly bitter irony of what was happening. They had let her in. Thelma had, in her hubris, asked Wallis to look after him, And now they watched as Wallis, a fellow grifter, a woman from an even poorer background than their own, did the one thing they never would or could do. Wallis was not content to be the mistress. Thelma had been the perfect mistress, beautiful, aristocratic by marriage, and, crucially, discreet. She understood the rules. She would have been the loving, supportive, and silent maîtresse antique for his entire reign. But Wallis had broken the code. She was demanding everything. In January 1936, the old immovable King George V died. The little man, Thelma's former lover, was now King Edward VIII, and the crisis, which had been a private scandal, became a constitutional catastrophe. The new king made his intentions clear. He would not give up Wallis Simpson. In fact, he was going to marry her as soon as her second divorce was final. Can you imagine the conversations between Thelma and Gloria? The bitterness, the sheer numb disbelief. "He's giving her jewelry," Thelma would say, her voice shaking with a rage she could show no one else. "Not just a bracelet, the crown jewels. He never gave me. He's marrying her." It was a personal, feminine, and deeply humiliating betrayal now playing out on an international stage, and Thelma, the jilted mistress, was forced to defend him, to defend herself. "He's not a fool," she would insist to friends. He's just in love." But in her heart she knew she had been the fling. She had been the safe married woman. Wallis, the plain, neat one, had somehow terrifyingly become an equal. Thelma had just been publicly exiled by the Vanderbilts for being un-American and degenerate. And now the woman who had taken her life was about to be exiled by the entire British Empire for the very same reasons. The press, having just finished their feast on the Morgans, now turned their full, undivided, and ravenous attention to the king's hussy. On December 11, 1936, he gave his abdication speech without the help and support of the woman I love. Perhaps Thelma and Gloria were in their Paris apartment, huddled around a crackling wireless radio, and they heard his voice, the voice that had whispered to Thelma 1,000 times, the voice she knew better than her own, and they heard him say it. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." He was gone. He had given up the throne. He had given up the British Empire, a quarter of the globe, for Wallis. In the space of 24 brutal months, Thelma Converse had witnessed the impossible. She had watched the Vanderbilt dynasty, the symbol of American power, publicly self-destruct in a courtroom over her own twin's child. And now she had watched the British monarchy, the symbol of global power, fracture and fall over the woman who had taken her place. She was the common denominator, the witness to both falls. For Thelma, the abdication was a final slamming door. The world she had known, of the Prince of Wales, of Fort Belvedere, of casual, intimate, borrowed power, was gone. The little man was gone, exiled to France as the Duke of Windsor, and the woman at his side was the one who had started it all. The new king, George VI, the shy, stuttering Bertie, and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, brought a new, cold, moral wind to the monarchy. They were the picture of staid, dutiful, domestic aristocracy. There was no room in this new, austere world for the fast set, and there was certainly no room for the scandalous Morgan twins. Thelma and Gloria were now doubly outcast. They were the women from the trial, and they were also the women from the last king's degenerate circle. They were footnotes, toxic reminders of an era everyone, especially the new royal family, wanted to forget. Their social ruin was total, and then their financial ruin became truly real. Thelma's divorce from Lord Furness was finalized. He was not generous. In fact, he was punitive. He had been publicly humiliated. He provided only a tiny, barely livable alimony, just enough so his name wouldn't be attached to a penniless woman, but not enough for her to live. Gloria, meanwhile, had nothing. The Vanderbilt court had granted her an insulting tiny allowance from her daughter's trust, an amount so small it was designed to punish her. They were back, Thelma Morgan and Gloria Morgan, back where they started. Only this time, their mother, Laura, the great general, was broke too, and now they had to support her as well. Their life became a desperate, frantic, and profoundly dull hustle. They moved to Los Angeles. This was the final, most humiliating abdication of all. They had conquered New York. They had conquered London. They had conquered Paris. Now they fled to a place that had no memory and cared nothing for their past. The one place where a bad reputation was just color. But they weren't stars. They weren't producers. They were once again just the Morgans. They tried again to monetize the only thing they had left, their name. They opened a small, chic, and utterly unsuccessful dress shop. They tried to sell their stories to the studios, but their stories were too real. They were too scandalous. They involved the King of England. They involved the Vanderbilts. No studio would touch it. They were reduced to living in a small rented bungalow, two middle-aged women haunted by their identical, beautiful, but now fading faces. And then, in 1939, the final definitive end, the world they had known of transatlantic crossings, Paris salons, and London seasons wasn't just in decline. It was on fire. The Nazi invasion of Poland, the fall of France. World War II was not just a political event. It was the end of their universe. It was the final definitive iron curtain slamming down, separating their glittering, frivolous past from a new, brutal, and terrifying present. There was no going back. Thelma and Gloria were now just two more refugees stranded in America, their past as irrelevant as a canceled party. The war years were the long, quiet, unrecorded years of their lives. They just survived. And Thelma, the witness, had to carry the psychological weight of all of it. She had to carry her sister's loss. For the rest of her life, she would have to listen to Gloria retell the story of the trial, obsessively, bitterly, and endlessly. If only the maid, the judge. She had to carry her own humiliation. She had to live in a world where Wallis Simpson was now the Duchess of Windsor, explicitly denied the style, Her Royal Highness. A woman who, though exiled, had won. She had gotten the man, she had gotten a title, she had gotten the jewels, and Thelma had nothing. This is the great unspoken tragedy of Thelma Converse. Her twin Gloria had a clean tragedy. She lost her child. It was a primal, understandable, noble grief. But Thelma's grief was messy, it was petty, it was unseemly. How do you mourn a man who was never yours? How do you rage against a woman who simply outplayed you? She had no right to it, and so it had nowhere to go. It just sat there, cold, hard, and indigestible in her heart for the next 30 years. She was the confidant, the keeper of everyone else's secrets. She was the one who absorbed her sister's pain, her lover's betrayal, and her family's humiliation. She was the sister who had watched 2 dynasties fall and was now living in a bungalow in Hollywood, just trying to make rent. The war was a dark, suffocating blanket. And when it finally lifted, the world that emerged in 1945 was one that Thelma and Gloria Morgan no longer recognized. It was not their world. Their world of ocean liners, Paris salons, royal mistresses, and aristocratic rules was gone. It had been bombed into rubble, and something new, loud, and brutally practical was being built in its place. The 1950s began. It was the atomic age, the age of suburbs, of television, of rock and roll. Thelma and Gloria, now in their late 40s and early 50s, were no longer just scandalous. They were, in many ways, worse. They were obsolete, relics of a frivolous, silly, and now slightly embarrassing era. And they were still broke. This was the long, slow, final act. The hustle, which had once been a glamorous, high-stakes game, was now a grim daily reality of middle age. They lived together for a time in New York, in a small apartment. They were still the Morgan twins, still beautiful, in a haunted, fragile, carefully preserved way, still, famously, dressing alike, a habit that now seemed less glamorous and more grotesque. They were still a single, indivisible entity. But their bond was no longer just love or loyalty. It was a bond of shared, bitter, profound resentment. It was a shared prison. They were two halves of a single broken object, glued fast together that nobody wanted anymore. They were trapped by their past. They were their past. It was the only thing they had to sell. And as they faded, the poor little rich girl, the child at the center of their downfall, was finally coming into her own. Little Gloria. Vanderbilt was little no more. She was a grown woman. At 17, she had seized control of her own trust fund. In a final act of rebellion against her Aunt Gertrude Whitney, she had run away. She had married disastrously a Hollywood agent. Then she had married spectacularly the conductor Leopold Stokowski. She was becoming an artist, a designer, a personality. While Thelma and her sister Gloria were fading into monochrome history, their Gloria, the new Gloria, was exploding in Technicolor. And this new Gloria, the adult, powerful, famous woman, she wanted nothing to do with them. She saw her mother, Gloria, and her aunt, Thelma, for exactly what they were. She did not see the victims of the trial. She saw two beautiful, charming, and utterly parasitic women. She saw the scented phantoms of her childhood, now returned, their hands out, asking for money, for introductions, for a way back in. Thelma and Gloria, the mother, would call, they would write, "Darling, we're in New York. We must see you. We must have lunch." And the adult Gloria, the survivor, would recoil. As her son, Anderson Cooper, would later say, his mother had an allergy to bullshit. And in her eyes, her mother and her aunt were the definition of it. This perhaps was the final, most bitter and most personal rejection of Thelma's life. The child she had been legally forbidden from seeing, the child whose loss had been the bedrock of her and her sister's shared martyrdom. That child was now an adult, and that adult was forbidding them. They had been rejected by the Vanderbilts. Thelma had been rejected by the King of England, and now they were being rejected by the poor little rich girl herself. They had one last card to play. If the world would not remember their story correctly, they would tell it. They would write the official record. They would at last have their say. In 1958, they co-wrote their memoirs. They called it, with a final defiant flourish of their old glamour, Double Exposure. The book is a fascinating, tragic, and profoundly shallow document. It is not a work of self-reflection. It is a masterpiece of self-defense. It is a 300-page, breathless, charming, and completely superficial cocktail party invitation. It is their entire lives, retold as a glittering, frothy jazz age anecdote. In its pages, the trial is not a tragedy. It is a crucifixion, a terrible misunderstanding, orchestrated by a villainous old woman, Gertrude, and a pack of lying, paid-off servants. Gloria's lesbianism is dismissed as a disgusting, ludicrous lie. Thelma's affair with the Prince of Wales is painted as a great, beautiful, noble romance, a true meeting of souls. And Wallis Simpson? This is where Thelma's 20-year-old unhealed wound bleeds onto the page. Wallis is the villain, a plain, neat woman, a scheming social climber. The book climaxes with Thelma's version of the betrayal, the famous "look after him for me" line, the return to the cold, wrong flowers at Fort Belvedere. It is a masterpiece of passive aggression. It is Thelma's one public final attempt to stick the knife in Wallis's back, just as she felt Wallis had stuck it in hers. And the world's reaction to this book? A collective, deafening, and absolute shrug. It was 1958. America was watching Sputnik. Elvis Presley was in the army. The world had little interest in a 25-year-old royal soap opera, retold by two bitter middle-aged women. The book, their last great hope, their last desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative, flopped. It did not restore their reputation. It did not grant them new fame. It did not make them rich. It just cemented their status as relics. This is where the final, tragic Capote connection comes in. In the 1950s and 60s, Truman Capote was the ringmaster of New York society. He, too, was obsessed with wealth, beauty, and tragedy. He had his new collection of swans, Babe Paley, Slim Keith, CZ Guest. These were the new queens. And who was his closest, most intricate, and most complicated friend? Gloria Vanderbilt, the daughter, the survivor. Capote was mesmerized by Gloria. He saw her as the ultimate survivor of the ultimate tragedy. He understood better than anyone the poor little rich girl narrative. And what did he see in her mother, Gloria, and her Aunt Thelma? He saw ghosts. He saw the anti-swans. He saw what his swans would one day become. He saw failure. He saw betrayal. He saw the swans after the fall. Thelma and Gloria Morgan were not invited to Capote's black and white ball in 1966. They were not part of his in crowd. They were the original cautionary tale, the story he whispered to his new friends. They were the women who had been publicly eviscerated, their secrets exposed, their lives ruined, not by a writer, but by a court of law, a king and a friend. Capote's Answered Prayers, the book that would one day destroy his swans, was just a pale echo of the judgment Judge Carew had passed on the Morgan twins 30 years earlier. Thelma and her sister were the first betrayed and now forgotten swans. Their twinship, their one lifelong defining relationship, began to fracture. Decades of shared failure, shared poverty, shared hiding, and shared nursing of 30-year-old cold hatreds. It was toxic. They were still the twins. They were still in their 60s, dressing alike. But the magic was gone. All that was left was two old women trapped in a small apartment with their scrapbooks, their ghosts, and their identical withered, bitter faces. And then the mirror cracked. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt died on February 13th, 1965 in Los Angeles. She was 61. She died in Hollywood. She died as she had lived in debt. She was, to the very end, estranged from her famous wealthy daughter. And Thelma, for the first time in her life, was alone. This is the final, ultimate, and most profound tragedy of Thelma Morgan Converse. Her entire life, her entire identity, had been defined as one of the twins. Gloria's success was her success. Gloria's failure was her failure. Her life was a reflection of and a reaction to her sister. Now her sister was gone. The mirror was empty. What was she? She was not Lady Furness. Her divorce had taken that. She was not the royal mistress. Wallis had taken that. She was not the beloved aunt. The court had taken that. And now she was not a twin. She was just Thelma, a true extra woman. A 61-year-old woman alone in a small apartment with a name that meant nothing and a past that everyone had forgotten. She lived for 5 more years, 5 quiet, lonely, unrecorded years. What did she think about in those final lonely days? Did she think of the courtroom and the flashbulbs? Did she think of her sister, Gloria, and the consuming bond they shared? Did she think of Fort Belvedere and the little man whose voice she knew better than her own? Or did she in the end just think of Wallis, the plain, neat woman who, at that very moment, was living in a Paris palace as the Duchess of Windsor, surrounded by jewels, still even in exile, the woman who had won? Thelma Lady Furness died on January 29, 1970. She was 66. She died in a New York hospital of a heart attack. Thelma's death 5 years after her twin brought a final quiet end to one of the 20th century's most glittering and tragic stories. But why does their story, the Morgan twins' story, matter? Why should we remember Thelma at all? Because what she witnessed and what she endured was not just forgotten society gossip. It is, in fact, a foundational myth of modern celebrity culture. Her life is the story of a witness. And the witness, we must understand, is often the most important and most tragic character of all. First, Thelma's story is the fall of the American gods. The Gloria Vanderbilt trial, which Thelma was dragged into, was the public execution of the Gilded Age. It was the moment the American public, ravaged by the Depression, was allowed to look behind the marble walls of the Vanderbilt dynasty. And what they saw was not greatness. They saw rot. They saw dysfunction, emotional emptiness, grotesque privilege, and a cold, brutal family war. The trial and Thelma's role in it as the degenerate aunt became a powerful symbol of the end of public reverence for these great industrial dynasties. They were not gods. They were just one more fabulously wealthy, dysfunctional family, tearing each other apart over a lonely, sad little girl. Thelma Converse, by her loyal stand at her sister's side, was the catalyst for that exposure. The scandal she was part of helped destroy the very institution she and her sister were raised to worship. Second, her life is the fall of the British gods. Thelma was the dress rehearsal for the Abdication. Her affair with the Prince of Wales, a beautiful, married American adventuress, was the scandal that primed the pump. Her relationship normalized the prince's dangerous taste for a certain type of woman, and it was her fatal trusting mistake, handing him over to Wallis Simpson, that lit the match. Thelma's private, intimate betrayal became the accidental prelude to the constitutional crisis that changed the British monarchy forever. She was the woman who, in her own small human way, lost her lover, and in doing so, created the opening that allowed another woman to cause England to lose its king. She was the last great royal mistress of the old world, and Wallis was the first terrifying modern royal wife of the new one. This is the Capote arc in full vivid color. Decades later, Truman Capote would become famous for befriending and then publicly, cruelly betraying the beautiful high society swans who trusted him. Thelma and Gloria Morgan were the originals. They were the template. They were the first swans to be betrayed not by a writer, but by a court of law, by their own servants, by their friends, and by the very establishment they had dedicated their lives to joining. Thelma's story is answered prayers, told 30 years earlier, but with binding, devastating legal consequences. She was the cautionary tale that Capote's friends like Babe Paley and Slim Keith should have studied but never did. But perhaps Thelma's most important and enduring legacy was the creation of the poor little rich girl. The media frenzy around that trial, the photographers, the screaming headlines, the obsessive voyeuristic public interest in the private, sexual, and financial lives of the rich and famous was new. Thelma and her sister Gloria were two of the very first celebrities to be simultaneously created and destroyed by the modern media machine. That trial created a template we still use every single day. The public dissection of a woman's fitness as a mother, the weaponization of her private life and sexuality, the battle for control of a famous name and a massive fortune. Every time we see a story about a female celebrity's toxic lifestyle or a scandalous custody battle, we are watching the ghost of the Vanderbilt trial. And Thelma Converse is the ghost at the center of it. Her life is a devastating, timeless lesson in the terrifying fragility of female power when it is sourced only from beauty, from marriage, and from proximity to powerful men. She had all three in their most potent forms. She had a title, she had wealth, she had a king, and in the space of 2 years, a court, her husband, and her friend took it all. She was left with nothing. The life of Thelma Morgan Converse is, in the end, a profound and deeply quiet tragedy. She is a footnote in the story of the royal mistress, a role she herself played. She is a footnote in the story of her unfit sister. She is a footnote in the story of her famous poor little rich girl niece, Gloria Vanderbilt. Her entire identity from her birth was collective. She was one of the twins, and her tragedy is that she was perhaps the most loyal of all. She was the ultimate confidant, the ultimate spare, the sister who always showed up. She was the one who stood by Gloria in the courtroom. She was the one who stood by the prince in his loneliness. She was the one who, her entire life, was defined by her relationship to others, and she was, in turn, consumed by all of them. Her sister Gloria had a clean, understandable, almost noble tragedy. She lost her child. Her rival, Wallis, had a clean, understandable victory. She won the king. But Thelma's tragedy was ambiguous. It was messy. It was a grief she had no public right to claim. How do you mourn a man who was never legally yours? How do you rage at a betrayal that, by the standards of the world, was just a social game you lost? How do you carry the public shame that was aimed at your sister and only hit you because you looked identical? Her life was a story of secondhand loss. She was the witness. She was the one who stood by, loyal and supportive, as her sisters flew toward the sun. She was the one who was there to catch them when they fell. And she was the one who was dragged down with them, stained by their scandals, and left to carry the weight of their sins. She was not the star of the show. She was not the villain. She was the collateral damage. Her life is a haunting, forgotten reminder that in the great, glittering, brutal tragedies of history, the most heartbreaking stories often belong to the person just outside the spotlight, the one who saw it all, heard it all, and kept all the secrets, and who, in the end, was left utterly and completely alone.